I was 24 and 3 years married when my parents' buggy passed our lane on an off Sunday, headed toward my older sister's farm. The wheel sound traveled over the gravel, softened near the creek, and rose again where the road climbed between the autumn fields. My husband worked beside the barn, while I stood on the porch with the bishop's wife, shelling peas beneath a pale afternoon sky. She had come after the shared meal with a shirt needing mending, and our Pennsylvania Dutch conversation had moved easily between weather and work. We watched my mother's cat pass the maple, followed by my father's familiar posture as the buggy continued beyond our gate toward the hill. Near evening chores, the same wheel sound returned from my sister's direction, crossed the culvert, and carried past us toward my parents' farm. The bishop's wife set a pea beside her work apron, drew the mending closer, and looked across the road after the dust settled. Her face held the plain steadiness she brought to church benches, shared meals, and ordinary porch work throughout our district. Then she turned toward me as daylight rested on the walnut branches, while I kept shelling peas beside her mending. In our district, G-May came every other Sunday, with hymn books opened along church benches and a shared meal following the morning worship. On the intervening Sunday, my parents usually traveled to my older sister's farm, where the fields lay farther along the same country road. She had married before I did, and their visits began while I still lived with my parents under the familiar Ordnung of home. The custom settled around garden soil, beans, milking, fence posts, and whatever weather brought that week. My mother wore her work apron after the meal, and my father often walked toward the barn before evening chores gathered everyone indoors. Their route became familiar through repetition, curving past the walnut, crossing the creek at the culvert, then climbing beside wide fields beyond. When I married, my husband and I settled on a farm earlier along that road, closer to my parents than my sister lived. Our lane opened from the gravel before the maple, and our gate stood where every outward journey toward her farm passed plainly nearby. At 24, I had lived there through 3 years of weather, seed corn, garden work, and daylight changing over the barn roof. My parents still followed the settled Sunday route, passing our lane in the afternoon and returning after the evening chores had begun. I could tell their direction from the wheel sound before the buggy reached the maple, especially when rain darkened the road near our gate. Their passing followed familiar motion as the buggy carried my parents along the road my father knew through the fields. Sometimes my mother lifted her face toward the porch, and sometimes my father guided the buggy onward while dust moved behind the wheels. I answered with a raised hand, then returned to beans, peas, shirt mending, or whatever farm work rested within the remaining daylight. My husband continued his own work around the barn and fence posts, leaving family customs for me to understand in my own time. The weekly rhythm felt inherited from years before my marriage, though our farm now stood inside the very road that carried it onward. I followed that rhythm through my own work, carrying the ache that arrived whenever the wheel sound faded uphill. During an autumn week, my parents came for conversation while my husband worked wire along the far fence posts. The maple had begun dropping color beside our lane, and rain from the previous evening left the garden soil dark around the beans. My mother helped gather peas beneath her work apron, while my father studied a barn place where weather had pressed against the boards. Their visit moved with ordinary ease, passing from milking to seed corn, then toward the colder daylight expected before the next G-May. As they prepared to travel home, I stood near the gate and asked them directly to spend the coming-off Sunday at our farm. My mother rested her hand against her work apron and replied, "Your sister is expecting us that Sunday. Another time, Sadie." My father glanced toward the road, then spoke about rain gathering beyond the fields and the need to reach home before evening chores. I accepted her words with the measured habit I had learned around family decisions, and we finished our conversation beside the damp gravel. That Sunday, I heard their buggy while I worked garden soil where beans had nearly finished their season. The wheels crossed the culvert, passed our lane, and continued toward my sister's farm as dust lifted lightly beyond the wet road edges. My mother's cap appeared briefly beneath the maple branches, and my father's shoulder turned with the bend before the fields hid them. My husband carried wire toward the fence posts, while I gathered the remaining beans and kept my hands within the work before me. The afternoon moved through milking and barn work, and pale daylight narrowed across the creek while weather pressed low over the road. Later, their wheel sound returned from beyond the hill, reached the culvert, and passed our gate at the same unhurried farm pace. I saw my mother facing forward and my father following the gravel home, with evening chores still ahead at their own place. Their unchanged direction settled clearly inside me after my invitation, while the wheels continued at their usual farm pace. I carried the beans toward the porch, brushed garden soil from my work apron, and joined my husband as daylight left the fields. The road and buggy remained ordinary, while my concern rested in the family habit guiding their direction. Winter brought snow beside the gate, and the wheel sound became lower over packed gravel whenever my parents traveled toward my sister's farm. Through spring rain, their buggy crossed the culvert with the same direction, while creek water moved under the road and fields softened. Summer daylight found me shelling peas on the porch as their passage lifted dust near the maple and carried it past our lane. I did not have a word for it yet. I only knew that each season altered the farm while the family root held steady, shaped by years that began before my marriage. The habit had grown through familiar Sundays, and its continuation followed the same road each time the off-Sunday arrived. My parents came at other times for ordinary needs, speaking about milking, weather, seed corn, or wire needed along the fence posts. Those visits kept our affection grounded in shared work, even as the Sunday route continued beyond the household added along their way. If a family habit has continued after circumstances changed, subscribe and share in the comments what helped your family speak about it. I kept my own words measured because a clear conversation could place the road, our farms, and my concern together. At Jime, I sat near my mother with our hymn books open, then joined the shared meal beneath the district's familiar ordnung. My father spoke with me about rain and fields, while my older sister remained part of the ordinary family rhythm around us. Around the church benches, my parents spoke with ordinary ease, and I carried my concern home with the same dignity I brought there. I began to understand that affection could remain present, while routine still overlooked a change standing plainly beside the road. That understanding eased the harshest edge of my hurt, though it also made direct speech feel more necessary as months continued. My husband listened when I spoke during evening chores, then returned beside me to milking and the work our own farm required. He stayed in the background of a matter belonging between me and my parents, offering steadiness through his ordinary conduct. By autumn, walnut leaves gathered near the culvert, and I could hear each wheel before the buggy came into view. I watched the road and shaped simple words that could name the route while leaving room for care. The bishop's wife came to our porch after a shared meal on an off Sunday, carrying a shirt whose sleeve needed mending. I brought peas from the garden, and we settled into ordinary work while afternoon daylight reached across the barn and nearby fields. Our Pennsylvania Dutch conversation touched on rain, the coming milking, garden soil, and weather settling beyond the walnut near the creek. She guided the thread through the shirt with practiced hands, while I opened peas and gathered them against my work apron. Her visit held the ease of many district porches, where useful hands carried conversation through steady work and measured speech. As we worked, the wheel sound rose from my parents' direction and traveled along the gravel toward the maple beside our lane. I recognized the pace before the buggy appeared, and my hands continued shelling while the road brought my parents into view. My mother's cap caught the afternoon light, and my father faced the curve leading past our gate toward my older sister's farm. The buggy crossed the lane opening, followed the road beyond the creek, and disappeared where the fields lifted toward her place. The bishop's wife kept mending, smoothing the shirt across her work apron before drawing the thread through the worn edge again. She turned her eyes toward the road for a moment, then placed the shirt carefully across her knees and resumed her work. I spoke about peas needing gathering before colder weather, and she answered through the easy movement of our earlier conversation. We remained on the porch as daylight shifted, working through peas and mending while the barn shadow lengthened toward the gravel. Evening chores approached gradually, carrying the familiar needs of milking and whatever work my husband had continued beside the fence posts. Then the returning wheel sound came from my sister's direction, steady beyond the fields before growing clearer near the creek. My parents' buggy crossed the culvert and passed our gate again, now following the road toward their farm in the fading daylight. My father looked ahead along the gravel, and my mother sat beside him as the maple branches moved above their passage. The sound diminished near the walnut, leaving the porch filled with the small motions of peas and thread through cloth. The bishop's wife folded the mended sleeve across her work apron, then lifted her face toward me while her hands held the shirt. I placed a pea with the gathered ones and looked toward the bend where my parents had gone after their ordinary journey. Her hands rested around the shirt, her expression steady, while our Pennsylvania Dutch conversation paused at the edge of something direct. The bishop's wife looked from the road toward me and asked, "Why do your parents pass your farm every other Sunday to visit your sister?" Her words held the route exactly as it stood, with my farm along the way and my sister's farm farther beyond the fields. I kept my hands near the peas and told her the habit had begun before I married, when my sister alone had a household. My parents used the intervening Sunday for that visit, while Jime shaped the remaining Sunday through hymn books, church benches, and a shared meal. After my marriage, my husband and I settled earlier on the same road, yet the older route continued through familiarity. I described our lane before the maple, the passing wheel sound, and the return journey from my sister's direction near evening chores. I also told her about the autumn afternoon when I spoke directly, and how the expected visit farther along already guided that Sunday. She drew the shirt across her knees, pressed the mended cloth with her palm, and listened while I finished shelling a pea. I said my concern had grown from being included in ordinary weekday work, while remaining outside this particular Sunday habit. The difference mattered because the road itself carried my parents past the household their family had gained through my marriage. She placed the finished shirt beside her work apron and gathered loose peas nearer, giving my words room through simple, useful movement. I spoke carefully about familiarity, since habits can continue through ease even when affection has already widened around changed family lives. The question helped me hear the root as a fact I could name plainly and carry into direct family conversation. She brushed garden soil from a pea, set it with the others, and kept her gaze near the work between us. My concern stayed specific, centered on the Sunday route and the direct family conversation it now required. The bishop's wife folded the shirt, adjusted her work apron, and continued listening as daylight moved lower across the barn. I told her I would visit my parents and speak about the unchanged habit directly, using the road and our households as plain language. She gathered the peas closer with her fingertips, looked toward the fields, and continued the steady work beside me. When evening chores drew near, we rose from the porch work, carrying the mended shirt and gathered peas into the remaining daylight. Her question stayed with me because its simple words could travel toward my parents in my own measured voice. I visited my parents during the following week, arriving while my mother worked with beans and my father returned from the barn. We spoke in Pennsylvania Dutch about weather and milking before I named the Sunday route directly, keeping my words close to what happened. I said their buggy passed our lane toward my sister's farm on each intervening Sunday, then returned from that direction near evening chores. My mother lowered her hands against her work apron, and my father stood beside the porch as I continued with steady care. I explained that the route began before my marriage, while my sister's household already stood farther along that familiar road. Since my husband and I had settled earlier along the same way, our household joined the family, while their custom kept its direction. My father answered that this was true, and said the road had become their familiar Sunday direction during those earlier years. My mother agreed, adding that they had continued from habit after my marriage, even though our farm now lay along their way. Their acknowledgement met the plain shape of the custom, and we stayed with it as daylight crossed their garden soil. I told them direct visits mattered to me, especially when the family had gained a household and the old route remained unchanged. My father rested his hand near a fence post, and my mother looked toward the road before speaking about future Sundays. We shared beans on their porch and allowed the conversation to settle among weather, work, and the care our family could choose deliberately. Across the later months, visits moved directly among our farms as rain darkened the gravel and snow gathered near the walnut, with my parents joining our milking before a shared meal, sitting on our porch while I mended my husband's shirt, helping with wire along the fence posts, shelling peas beside my work apron, and speaking about seed corn as evening chores drew close. Other Sundays carried ordinary time at my sister's farm, and the road served each household through direct visits and shared work. The visits gained their meaning from direct presence, with each shared task carrying the same everyday weight as the meal beside it. Deliberate care entered our family routine through steady visits, shared work, and conversation across the months that followed. What changed was our willingness to speak before custom decided the route, leaving affection room to take an active shape. Family routines often begin inside an earlier arrangement, when a marriage, a move, or a household gives ordinary weeks their dependable shape. Then life changes along the same road, while familiar conduct keeps traveling in the direction it already knows through weather and work. My parents understood the route once I named it directly, because the road carried a history formed during earlier family years. I also understood them more fully when they acknowledged familiarity, since their answer gave our family a clear place to begin. Direct speech placed the concern between us in plain daylight, where care could respond through visits instead of promises shaped for ceremony. The repair grew through milking, beans, peas, mending, shared meals, and porch conversations spread across later months and changing weather. Each ordinary visit mattered because it was chosen with awareness, and every shared task carried its own everyday weight. My sister's earlier place in the family rhythm remained part of our history, while my marriage added a household deserving direct care. The bishop's wife gave me a clear question, then let her hands remain with useful work while I found my own answer. When old routines pass a changed family life, hurt can deepen beneath ordinary conduct unless someone speaks with courage and measured kindness. Care becomes deliberate when people name what has continued, acknowledge how it began, and choose presence suited to the family as it stands. I learned that a road can remain familiar while its direction becomes more generous, guided by conversation and deliberate family care. The wheel sound later carried the same farm steadiness, crossing gravel, creek, and culvert beneath walnut shade or winter snow. Yet I received it differently because our visits now grew from spoken care, with room for every household formed through marriage and change. That growth lived in work aprons, shirt mending, garden soil, and daylight shared before evening chores. Our family remained ordinary and weathered, still learning how affection must sometimes leave its accustomed road and arrive through deliberate presence. I wrote it all down in my book, A Quiet and Faithful Home. The full story is in the first pinned comment. The link is there. Its pages follow the steady work of speaking with dignity, receiving family history with compassion, and shaping daily care through ordinary choices. May its pages sit beside your own questions, with the warmth of a shared meal and the steadiness of familiar hymn books. Carry what serves your household into the coming weather, and let direct care find its way through your daily work ahead.